In the dust-swept valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the first cities rose from reed marshes and humanity took its earliest steps towards civilization, there lies a story so ancient that it predates written history itself. Yet paradoxically, it is through writing that this story comes to us, carved into clay tablets by hands that turned to dust thousands of years before the pyramids were built. Tonight, we journey into the deep time of human memory, into the realm where mythology and history intertwine so closely that separating them becomes an exercise in archaeology itself. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind settle into the rhythm of centuries passing like seasons. Forget about the urgent tick of modern time. Forget about tomorrow's obligations. For the next few hours, we exist in the vast, unhurried pace of ancient civilizations, where a single dynasty might span longer than our entire recorded history. The Anunnaki. The name itself carries the weight of millennia, echoing from cuneiform tablets into modern consciousness through pathways both scholarly and speculative. They were the children of the sky god Anu, the judges of fate, the arbiters of human destiny in the world's first urban civilization. But who were they really? And how did their influence shape the very foundations of human society for 5,000 years? The story begins not with gods descending from the heavens, but with humans ascending from the marshes. Around 3,500 BCE, in the southernmost region of Mesopotamia known as Sumer, something unprecedented occurred in human history. For the first time, people began to live together in organized cities, to specialize in crafts and trades, to develop systems of writing and law that would endure for millennia. These early Sumerians faced challenges that no human society had ever confronted before. How do you organize thousands of people living in close proximity? How do you distribute resources fairly? How do you preserve knowledge and pass it to future generations? How do you explain the forces of nature that can destroy your carefully built civilization in a single flood season? The answers they developed would echo through 5,000 years of human history, and at the center of those answers stood the Anunnaki. But to understand who the Anunnaki were and why they matter, we must first understand the world that created them, a world rising from the fertile mud of ancient Mesopotamia, like the first breath of human civilization itself. The land between the rivers was harsh and unforgiving. Unlike Egypt, blessed with the predictable floods of the Nile, Mesopotamia faced chaotic deluges that could wash away entire settlements, followed by droughts that could last for years. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers changed course regularly, turning fertile farmland into desert, and desert into swamp with seemingly arbitrary cruelty. Yet it was precisely this unpredictability that forged the character of Mesopotamian civilization. Unable to rely on nature's consistency, the Sumerians were forced to develop technologies and social systems of unprecedented sophistication. They created the world's first irrigation networks, engineering projects that required coordinated labor from thousands of workers across multiple generations. They invented the wheel, not for transportation as we might assume, but for pottery making, recognizing that circular motion could shape clay more perfectly than human hands alone. They developed the first mathematical systems, using base 60 counting that we still employ today in measuring time and angles. They created the first written laws, the first schools, the first professional armies, the first bureaucratic governments. But perhaps most importantly for our story, they created the first systematic theology, a complex understanding of divine hierarchy that would influence religious thought for millennia to come. At the apex of this divine system stood Anu, the god of heaven, whose name means literally sky or heaven in ancient Sumerian. Anu was not a personal god in the way later Mediterranean cultures would understand divinity. He was too vast and remote for direct human interaction, like the sky itself. Instead, he delegated authority to his children, a pantheon of deities who governed different aspects of earthly and cosmic existence. These divine children were known collectively as the Anunnaki, literally those who came from heaven to earth, or alternatively, the children of Anu. The Anunnaki were not a monolithic group, but a complex family of deities with individual personalities, areas of responsibility, and relationships with each other that often mirrored human social dynamics. Enlil, the god of air and storms, held executive authority over earthly affairs. Enki, also called Ea, the god of wisdom and fresh water, served as the craftsman and problem-solver of the divine family. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, controlled fertility and childbirth. These three formed a triad of supreme authority within the Anunnaki, but they were joined by dozens of other deities with more specialized functions. Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose Akkadian name Ishtar would echo through history into the modern names for Easter and other fertility celebrations. Marduk, who would eventually become the supreme god of Babylon. Nergal, lord of the underworld and plague. Ningal, goddess of reeds, whose marshes were the economic foundation of early Sumerian civilization. What made the Anunnaki unique in the history of world religions was their bureaucratic nature. They were not mysterious, unknowable forces but divine civil servants, each with specific duties and areas of jurisdiction. This reflected the organizational genius of Sumerian society, which was itself the first human civilization to develop complex bureaucratic institutions. The Sumerians understood that managing a city-state with tens of thousands of residents required delegation of authority, record-keeping, and systems of accountability that could function across generations. They projected this same understanding onto their conception of cosmic government, imagining the universe as a vast administrative system, with the Anunnaki serving as department heads, reporting ultimately to the sky god Anu. This bureaucratic conception of divinity had profound implications for how the Sumerians understood human society and human purpose. If the universe itself was organized as a governmental system, then earthly governments were reflections of cosmic order. Kings ruled by divine mandate not because they were chosen by gods, but because they were fulfilling their role in a cosmic administrative hierarchy. The earliest Sumerian city-states were theocratic entities, where temples served not only religious functions, but also economic and administrative ones. The temple complexes, called ziggurats, were not merely houses of worship, but were also granaries, schools, workshops, and government offices all combined into single massive structures that dominated the landscape for miles around. The priests who administered these temple complexes were not simply religious leaders, but were also judges, scribes, engineers, astronomers, and economic administrators. They kept detailed records of agricultural production, managed irrigation systems, resolved legal disputes, and maintained the calendar systems that told farmers when to plant and harvest their crops. These priestly administrators saw themselves as servants of the Anunnaki, carrying out divine will through practical governance. The tablets they created to record their activities were not merely bureaucratic documents, but were also religious acts, ways of participating in the cosmic order that the Anunnaki represented. It is from these tablets, tens of thousands of them discovered in archaeological sites across Mesopotamia, that our knowledge of the Anunnaki comes. The tablets span nearly 3 millennia, from the earliest Sumerian city-states around 3500 BCE through the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire to Persian conquest in 539 BCE. Reading these tablets is like listening to a conversation that spans 50 centuries, as each generation of scribes copied, modified, and reinterpreted the stories and lists and bureaucratic records of their predecessors. The Anunnaki who appear in the earliest Sumerian tablets are somewhat different from those who appear in later Akkadian texts, who are different again from those in Babylonian mythology, who evolved further in Assyrian religion. This evolution was not random but reflected the changing needs and circumstances of Mesopotamian civilization as it grew from isolated city-states into vast empires spanning the entire Middle East. The Anunnaki adapted to these changes, their stories and functions modified to address new political realities and incorporate the religious traditions of conquered peoples. The most famous of these adaptations is the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, composed sometime around 1200 BCE. This epic retells much older Sumerian creation stories but elevates Marduk, originally a relatively minor Anunnaki deity, associated with the city of Babylon, to supreme authority over the entire pantheon. The political implications were obvious. As Babylon became the dominant power in Mesopotamia, its patron deity had to be portrayed as the supreme god, superior even to the ancient Enlil and Enki. The Enuma Elish accomplishes this by describing a cosmic war in which younger gods, led by Marduk, defeat older chaos deities and establish a new divine order with Marduk as king. But the Enuma Elish is more than political propaganda disguised as mythology. It represents a sophisticated theological reflection on the nature of order and chaos, creation and destruction, youth and age. The older gods in the epic are not portrayed as evil, but as representative of primordial forces that, while necessary for creation, must be regulated and channeled by younger, more organized deities. This theme of divine evolution and generational change runs through much of Anunnaki mythology and reflects the real historical experience of Mesopotamian peoples who lived through constant political upheaval as new empires rose and fell, each bringing its own gods and customs while somehow preserving continuity with the past. The mechanism by which this continuity was preserved was the institution of the scribble school, one of humanity's first educational systems. Young men from wealthy families would spend years learning to read and write cuneiform script by copying ancient texts, including the stories and hymns dedicated to the Anunnaki. These scribal schools were not merely centres of literacy training, but were also theological seminaries where the religious traditions of Mesopotamia were preserved and transmitted across generations. The students who graduated from these schools became the priests, administrators, and scholars who maintained Mesopotamian civilization for over 3,000 years. The curriculum of these scribal schools included not only religious texts but also mathematical exercises, legal documents, business contracts, and scientific observations. This integration of sacred and secular knowledge reflected the Mesopotamian understanding that all knowledge was ultimately divine knowledge, since the Anunnaki were responsible for all aspects of existence. This holistic approach to education meant that Mesopotamian scholars made contributions to astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and engineering that would influence later civilizations for millennia. The mathematical techniques they developed for calculating the movements of planets and stars, originally created to determine the will of the Anunnaki through celestial omens, became the foundation of later Greek and Islamic astronomy. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Anunnaki-related texts was particularly sophisticated. Mesopotamian astronomers were the first to recognize that planetary movements follow predictable patterns, the first to divide the sky into the zodiacal constellations we still use today, and the first to develop mathematical models for predicting eclipses and planetary positions. This astronomical knowledge was considered sacred because the movements of celestial bodies were understood as the activities of the Anunnaki themselves. Each planet was associated with a particular Anunnaki deity: Marduk with Jupiter, Ishtar with Venus, Nergal with Mars, Ninurta with Saturn, and Nabu with Mercury. The positions and movements of these planets were interpreted as communications from the Anunnaki to earthly rulers, providing guidance for military campaigns, economic decisions, and religious ceremonies. Teams of professional astronomers serving in temple complexes throughout Mesopotamia maintained detailed observational records that allowed them to predict celestial events years in advance. These prediction abilities gave the astronomers enormous political influence, since kings relied on their interpretations of celestial omens when making important decisions. The astronomers, in turn, used their influence to maintain and expand the temple institutions that supported their research, creating a feedback loop between scientific knowledge and religious authority that characterized Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. The scientific achievements of these astronomer priests were remarkable by any standard. They determined the length of the year to within minutes of modern measurements, created mathematical models of planetary motion accurate enough to predict celestial events decades in advance, and compiled star catalogues that remained the most comprehensive in the world until the development of telescopic astronomy. But their most significant contribution to human knowledge may have been their development of systematic observational methodology. Unlike earlier cultures that approached astronomical phenomena through pure mythology, the Mesopotamians combined mythological interpretation with careful empirical observation and mathematical analysis. This combination of empirical observation, mathematical modelling, and theological interpretation created a uniquely powerful approach to understanding natural phenomena that would influence the development of science throughout the ancient world. Greek philosophers like Thales and Pythagoras studied with Mesopotamian astronomer priests and incorporated their methods into what would eventually become the philosophical foundations of Western science. Yet this scientific tradition remained embedded within the religious framework of Anunnaki worship for over 2 millennia. Even as Mesopotamian civilization was conquered successively by Persians, Greeks, and Romans, local communities continued to maintain their traditional astronomical practices and preserve their collections of Anunnaki-related texts. The resilience of these traditions is evident in the survival of astronomical cuneiform texts well into the Hellenistic period. Some of the latest cuneiform tablets known to scholars, dating to the 1st century BCE, contain astronomical calculations and ritual instructions related to Anunnaki worship, composed more than 3,000 years after the first appearance of these deities in Sumerian literature. This extraordinary continuity makes the Anunnaki one of the longest-lasting religious traditions in human history, spanning a period longer than the entire history of Christianity and Islam combined. During this vast sweep of time, the stories, functions, and worship practices associated with the Anunnaki evolved continuously while maintaining recognizable core elements that connected the latest Babylonian priest to his Sumerian predecessors across 150 generations. Understanding this continuity requires understanding the social and economic structures that supported it. Mesopotamian temple complexes were not merely religious institutions, but were also major economic enterprises, controlling vast agricultural estates, manufacturing workshops, and trade networks that extended across the known world. The wealth generated by these enterprises supported not only the priests and administrators who managed them, but also the scribes, scholars, and artisans who preserved and transmitted Anunnaki traditions. Temple workshops employed specialized craftsmen who created the statues, reliefs, and ceremonial objects used in the Anunnaki worship, while temple schools trained the next generation of priests and administrators. The economic power of the temples gave them significant political influence, allowing them to maintain their traditional practices even when political authority changed hands. Persian, Greek, and Roman rulers generally found it easier to work with existing temple hierarchies than to replace them, leading to a pragmatic accommodation between foreign political authority and local religious tradition. This accommodation was facilitated by the adaptable nature of Anunnaki theology itself. Because the Anunnaki were conceived as a bureaucratic hierarchy, rather than as absolute deities, their worship could be modified to acknowledge foreign rulers without abandoning traditional practices. New gods could be incorporated into the Anunnaki pantheon, and existing deities could be given new functions or attributes that reflected changed political circumstances. The flexibility of the Anunnaki system is perhaps best illustrated by its response to the rise of monotheistic religions in the late ancient period. Rather than directly opposing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, many Mesopotamian communities found ways to interpret their traditional deities as aspects, or servants, of the supreme god worshipped by their new neighbours. This syncretistic approach allowed elements of Anunnaki tradition to survive long after the formal end of Mesopotamian civilization. Traces of Anunnaki mythology can be found in the folklore and religious practices of Middle Eastern communities well into the medieval period, and some scholars argue that certain elements persist in contemporary Iraqi and Kurdish traditions. The transmission of Anunnaki traditions was not limited to the Middle East. As Mesopotamian civilization expanded through trade and conquest, its religious ideas spread throughout the ancient world and influenced the development of other mythological systems. Elements of Anunnaki mythology can be recognized in Greek, Roman, Germanic, and Indian religious traditions, though often so transformed as to be nearly unrecognizable. The influence of Anunnaki traditions on biblical literature has been particularly well documented. The flood story in Genesis clearly derives from much older Mesopotamian flood narratives featuring Anunnaki deities, while the creation account in Genesis incorporates elements from the Enuma Elish and other Mesopotamian creation myths. The Book of Ezekiel contains descriptions of divine beings that closely resemble Anunnaki iconography, and the angelic hierarchies described in later Jewish and Christian literature show clear organizational similarities to the bureaucratic structure of the Anunnaki pantheon. This influence was not simply a matter of borrowing isolated stories or images, but reflected the profound impact of Mesopotamian civilization on the entire development of ancient Middle Eastern culture. The Mesopotamians were the first people to develop urban civilization, and their solutions to the challenges of urban life became templates that other cultures adapted to their own circumstances. The legal traditions of ancient Israel, for example, show clear influences from much older Mesopotamian law codes, particularly the Code of Hammurabi, which was itself presented as a divine revelation from the Anunnaki deity Marduk. The administrative structures described in biblical accounts of the Israelite monarchy closely resemble those developed in Mesopotamian city-states centuries earlier. Even the biblical conception of divine kingship, the idea that earthly rulers govern by divine mandate, derives from Mesopotamian political theology, in which kings were understood as representatives of the Anunnaki on Earth. The ritual practices associated with kingship in ancient Israel, including coronation ceremonies and royal psalms, show clear parallels to much older Mesopotamian traditions. This cultural transmission was facilitated by the cosmopolitan nature of the ancient Middle East, where trade networks and diplomatic relations ensured regular contact between different peoples and their traditions. Mesopotamian merchants, administrators, and craftsmen travelled throughout the region, carrying their religious ideas along with their commercial goods. The cuneiform writing system developed by the Mesopotamians became the diplomatic language of the ancient Middle East, used for international correspondence from Egypt to Iran. Documents written in cuneiform necessarily carried with them the cultural assumptions and religious concepts of their creators, gradually familiarizing other peoples with Mesopotamian ways of thinking about divinity and cosmic order. Archaeological excavations throughout the Middle East have revealed Mesopotamian religious artifacts in contexts far from their places of origin, indicating not just trade relationships, but also the adoption of Mesopotamian religious practices by foreign communities. Cylinder seals depicting Anunnaki deities have been found in sites as distant as India and Central Asia, while Mesopotamian-style temples have been excavated in locations from Turkey to the Persian Gulf. This geographical spread of Anunnaki-related religious practices created a common cultural foundation that facilitated communication and cooperation across the diverse peoples of the ancient Middle East. Shared religious concepts provided a common vocabulary for diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange that helped stabilize the region despite its political fragmentation. The stabilizing influence of shared religious traditions becomes particularly evident during periods of political upheaval, when local communities often maintained their traditional practices even as political authority collapsed around them. The Anunnaki provided a source of continuity and identity that transcended the rise and fall of individual kingdoms and empires. This resilience was built into the structure of Anunnaki religion itself, which emphasized the eternal nature of divine authority in contrast to the temporary nature of human political power. Kings and dynasties might come and go, but the Anunnaki endured, providing a stable framework for understanding existence that could outlast any political upheaval. The theological sophistication of this framework is evident in the complex narratives developed around individual Anunnaki deities, stories that explore fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the problem of evil, the meaning of suffering, and the destiny of humanity. These narratives were not simple moral tales, but were sophisticated philosophical meditations comparable to the greatest works of later religious literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous work of Mesopotamian literature, exemplifies this philosophical sophistication. Although Gilgamesh himself is not one of the Anunnaki, the epic explores his relationships with various Anunnaki deities and uses these interactions to examine questions about mortality, friendship, the abuse of power, and the search for meaning in an uncertain world. The epic's treatment of the flood narrative, in which the Anunnaki deity Ea warns the human hero Utnapishtim of an impending deluge sent by the other gods, presents a complex meditation on divine justice and mercy that has influenced flood narratives throughout world literature. The story does not present the flood as either purely just or purely arbitrary, but as the result of competing divine perspectives on human nature and destiny. This theological sophistication reflects the intellectual environment of the Mesopotamian scribal schools, where generations of scholars refined and elaborated traditional narratives through centuries of discussion and debate. The Anunnaki stories that have come down to us are the products of this long process of theological reflection, representing some of humanity's earliest systematic attempts to understand the nature of existence through narrative and symbol. The symbolic richness of these stories has ensured their continued relevance long after the collapse of the civilization that created them. Modern readers of the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, often find it more psychologically convincing than much later literature, because its exploration of universal human experiences transcends the cultural particularities of its ancient Mesopotamian setting. This universal relevance explains why Anunnaki stories continue to fascinate contemporary audiences, though often in forms quite different from their original contexts. The themes they explore, questions about human nature, divine authority, cosmic order, and individual destiny, remain as pressing today as they were 5,000 years ago, when the first Sumerian scribes began recording them on clay tablets. The process by which these ancient stories have been reinterpreted and adapted for contemporary audiences illustrates the ongoing vitality of the mythological tradition the Mesopotamians created. Each generation finds new meanings in the old stories, new ways of understanding human experience through the lens of divine bureaucracy that the Anunnaki represent. Modern archaeological discoveries have added new dimensions to our understanding of these stories by providing physical evidence for the historical contexts in which they were created and transmitted. Excavations at sites like Ur, Babylon, Nineveh, and Mari have revealed the actual temple complexes where Anunnaki worship was practiced, the schools where their stories were taught, and the libraries where their traditions were preserved. These archaeological discoveries have confirmed many details preserved in the textual sources, while also revealing aspects of Mesopotamian civilization that the texts do not mention. The physical remains of Mesopotamian cities show evidence of sophisticated urban planning, advanced engineering techniques, and complex economic systems that support the picture of a highly developed civilization presented in the Anunnaki literature. But archaeology has also revealed the human cost of this civilization, evidence of social stratification, military conquest, and environmental degradation that the religious texts generally do not address. The same irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible also led to soil salinization that eventually reduced agricultural productivity and contributed to the decline of many city-states. This archaeological evidence provides a more complete and more realistic picture of the civilization that created and maintained the Anunnaki tradition for millennia. The Mesopotamians were neither primitive peoples creating crude mythologies, nor advanced beings possessing supernatural knowledge, but were simply humans like ourselves, trying to understand their place in the universe and organize their societies in ways that would allow them to survive and prosper. Their religious traditions, including their worship of the Anunnaki, were part of this larger human project of creating meaning and order in the face of uncertainty and change. The sophistication of their theological thinking reflects not divine revelation, but the accumulated wisdom of many generations of careful observation and reflection on human experience. This human dimension of the Anunnaki tradition makes it more, rather than less significant for contemporary audiences. The Mesopotamians' success in creating religious and social institutions that lasted for millennia demonstrates the potential of human creativity and cooperation when directed toward constructive purposes. Their example suggests that the problems facing contemporary civilization, challenges of urban organization, resource management, social coordination, and meaning-making, are not unprecedented, but are variations on problems that humans have successfully addressed before. The solutions the Mesopotamians developed may not be directly applicable to our circumstances, but their approach to problem-solving remains relevant and instructive. The Anunnaki tradition exemplifies this problem-solving approach through its integration of practical and spiritual concerns. Rather than treating religion and governance as separate spheres, the Mesopotamians developed systems that addressed both material and psychological needs within unified institutional frameworks. This holistic approach allowed them to create remarkably stable social systems that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential continuities across many generations. The longevity of the Anunnaki tradition itself demonstrates the effectiveness of this approach, showing how religious concepts can evolve and adapt while maintaining their essential functions within human communities. Understanding this adaptive capacity helps explain why elements of the Anunnaki tradition continue to appear in contemporary culture, often in highly transformed but still recognizable forms. The basic organizational model of the Anunnaki, divine hierarchy, with specialized functions and bureaucratic coordination, continues to influence how people think about cosmic order and social organization. The influence appears not only in explicitly religious contexts, but also in secular frameworks for understanding governance, corporate management, and even scientific research. The Mesopotamian insight that complex systems require hierarchical organization with clear divisions of responsibility and accountability has become a fundamental principle of modern institutional design. But contemporary adaptations of Anunnaki themes often lack the theological sophistication of their ancient predecessors, reducing complex mythological narratives to simple stories of good versus evil, or treating ancient religious concepts as if they were factual historical accounts, rather than symbolic explorations of universal human concerns. This reduction of symbolic richness to literal interpretation represents a significant loss of cultural sophistication, making ancient wisdom less accessible to contemporary audiences who might benefit from its insights. The Mesopotamian understanding of mythology as a vehicle for philosophical reflection, rather than as factual reporting, offers a more mature approach to religious tradition that could enrich contemporary spiritual and intellectual life. The key to recovering this more sophisticated approach lies in understanding the original contexts in which Anunnaki traditions developed and flourished. These contexts were not primitive or superstitious, but were characterized by intellectual rigor, institutional sophistication, and practical wisdom developed through centuries of experience with urban civilization. The scribes and priests who preserved and elaborated Anunnaki traditions were not naive believers in literal divine intervention, but were thoughtful interpreters of symbolic narratives that encoded practical knowledge about human psychology, social dynamics, and natural phenomena. Their approach to religious tradition combined reverence for inherited wisdom with intellectual flexibility that allowed for continuous adaptation and refinement. This balance between tradition and innovation characterizes the Anunnaki literature throughout its long history and explains how it remained relevant across such vast changes in political, social, and technological circumstances. The tradition survived because it was never simply a fixed set of beliefs, but was rather a living intellectual framework that could accommodate new experiences while preserving essential insights about human nature and social organization. Modern audiences seeking to understand the continuing significance of the Anunnaki would benefit from adopting a similar balance between respect for ancient wisdom and critical intellectual engagement. This approach would allow contemporary readers to appreciate the sophistication of Mesopotamian thought without falling into either uncritical acceptance or dismissive rejection of unfamiliar concepts and narratives. The reward for such balanced engagement is access to one of humanity's most sustained and sophisticated efforts to understand the cosmos and our place within it. The Anunnaki tradition represents 5,000 years of continuous theological and philosophical reflection, a treasure trove of human wisdom that remains largely untapped by contemporary culture. As we settle into the deeper rhythms of this ancient story, let the weight of these millennia slow your breathing and calm your restless thoughts. The Anunnaki existed in time measured not by the brief span of individual human lives, but by the slow cycles of civilizational rise and transformation. Their stories unfold across centuries and epochs, requiring a different kind of attention than our rapid modern world typically demands. In the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts, the ancient wisdom embedded in these 5,000-year-old traditions continues to resonate. The questions the Mesopotamians asked about divine authority, human responsibility, cosmic order, and individual destiny remain our questions. The solutions they developed continue to inform our own attempts to create meaning and order in an uncertain world. The Anunnaki were never meant to be understood as literal historical figures, but as enduring symbols of humanity's ongoing dialogue with the mystery of existence itself. Through their complex mythologies, their bureaucratic hierarchies, their integration of practical and spiritual concerns, they offer us a model for approaching that dialogue with both intellectual rigor and spiritual openness. Tonight, as consciousness gradually releases its hold on the immediate concerns of daily life, these ancient voices continue their eternal conversation about what it means to be human in a universe that seems both meaningful and mysterious. The rhythm of their discourse matches the deeper rhythms of sleep itself, carrying us into dreams where the boundaries between ancient and modern, human and divine, individual and cosmic begin to blur and merge. In sleep, we join that conversation not as outside observers, but as participants in the ongoing human project of making sense of existence. The Anunnaki become not distant deities, but aspects of our own continuing search for wisdom, order, and meaning in the beautiful complexity of conscious life. Their 5,000-year story becomes part of our story. Their questions become our questions. Their patient exploration of cosmic mystery becomes our own gentle drift into the vast healing darkness of restful sleep. The great temple complexes of ancient Mesopotamia have crumbled into dust, but the conversations they fostered about ultimate questions continue in every human heart that wonders about its place in the cosmos. The cuneiform tablets that preserved Anunnaki stories for millennia have given way to different technologies, but the need for wisdom about how to live meaningful lives in community with others remains as urgent today as it was when the first Sumerian cities rose from the marshes between the rivers. In the approaching quiet of sleep, these ancient rhythms of questioning and searching provide a foundation more stable than any empire, more enduring than any monument, more reliable than any technology. The Anunnaki offer not answers but better questions, not certainty but deeper mystery, not escape from the human condition, but fuller participation in its ongoing evolution toward greater wisdom and compassion. Let these 5,000 years of human reflection on cosmic order become a gentle current carrying your consciousness toward your rest. In dreams, the distinction between questioner and question dissolves, and we become part of the eternal conversation itself, adding our voices to the ancient chorus that began when humans first looked up at the stars and wondered about their meaning, their purpose, and their place in the magnificent ongoing mystery of existence itself. The practical worship of the Anunnaki in daily Mesopotamian life reveals layers of sophistication that modern interpretations often miss. The temple complexes dedicated to these deities were not merely places of worship, but were functioning cities within cities, complete with their own economic systems, judicial courts, educational institutions, and administrative hierarchies that managed resources across vast territories. The ziggurat of Marduk in Babylon, known as Anunnaki, and possibly the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, stood nearly 300 feet high and was visible from 20 miles away across the flat Mesopotamian plain. This was not simply a monument to divine glory, but a carefully engineered structure that served multiple practical functions while embodying complex theological concepts about the relationship between heaven and earth. The ziggurat's 7 terraced levels corresponded to the 7 celestial spheres recognized by Mesopotamian astronomy, with each level dedicated to different aspects of Marduk's divine authority. The lowest level housed administrative offices where priests managed the temple's vast agricultural estates and commercial enterprises. The second level contained workshops where skilled craftsmen created the ceremonial objects used in religious rituals. The third level housed schools where young scribes learned to read and write cuneiform script by copying ancient Anunnaki texts. Higher levels were progressively more restricted, accessible only to priests of increasing rank and specialization. The sixth level contained the temple's library, where master scribes preserved the astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and religious commentaries that formed the intellectual foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. Only the highest-ranking priests could ascend to the 7th level, where the golden statue of Marduk resided in a chamber designed to catch and reflect the first rays of dawnlight. This vertical organization reflected the Mesopotamian understanding of cosmic hierarchy, where divine authority flowed downward through increasingly specific levels of jurisdiction. But it also served practical purposes, creating secure storage for valuable materials, controlling access to sensitive information, and providing a visible symbol of social organization that could be seen and understood by everyone in the surrounding region. The economic power of such temple complexes was enormous. The Temple of Marduk controlled agricultural lands that extended for hundreds of miles along the Euphrates River, employing thousands of farmers, shepherds, and agricultural workers who produced grain, dates, wool, and other commodities that were traded throughout the ancient world. Temple workshops produced textiles, metalwork, pottery, and luxury goods that were exported as far as India and Central Asia. The wealth generated by these activities funded not only religious ceremonies and priestly salaries, but also public works projects that benefited entire cities. Temple administrators organized the construction and maintenance of irrigation canals, city walls, roads, and harbors that made urban civilization possible. They also provided social services that we would recognize today as healthcare, education, and welfare assistance for the poor and disabled. The priests who managed these complex operations were highly educated professionals who underwent years of specialized training in theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and business administration. The curriculum of the scribble schools that produced these priest administrators was remarkably comprehensive, covering subjects that would not be reunited in European education until the development of medieval universities nearly 2 millennia later. Students began their education around age 7 by learning to form cuneiform signs on practice tablets made of clay that could be recycled indefinitely. The basic curriculum included reading and writing exercises based on traditional religious texts, particularly hymns and myths relating to the Anunnaki. But students also learned mathematical techniques for calculating areas, volumes and proportions needed for architectural and engineering projects. Advanced students studied astronomy, learning to predict the movements of planets and stars that were identified with various Anunnaki deities. This astronomical knowledge was considered essential for determining the proper timing of religious festivals and for interpreting omens that guided political and economic decisions. The most accomplished students went on to specialize in fields like medicine, law, or temple administration, careers that provided social status and economic security while serving the religious community. The educational system that produced these scholar priests was remarkably stable, maintaining consistent standards and curricula across centuries of political upheaval. Archaeological excavations have revealed school exercises from sites separated by hundreds of miles and centuries of time that show nearly identical approaches to teaching mathematics, astronomy, and religious literature. This educational consistency helped preserve and transmit Anunnaki traditions across the vast expanses of space and time that characterized Mesopotamian civilization. The preservation of these traditions was facilitated by the durability of the cuneiform writing system and clay tablet technology that the Mesopotamians developed. Unlike papyrus or parchment, which deteriorates rapidly in most climates, properly fired clay tablets can survive for millennia even when buried in the ground. Tens of thousands of these tablets have been recovered from archaeological sites, providing an extraordinarily detailed record of Mesopotamian religious, economic, and intellectual life. Reading these tablets is like eavesdropping on conversations that took place thousands of years ago. Business contracts record the daily operations of temple enterprises, revealing how priest administrators managed complex economic relationships across vast trade networks. Legal documents show how religious law was applied to resolve disputes about property, marriage, inheritance, and commercial obligations. Personal letters provide glimpses into the private lives and concerns of individuals whose world was shaped by their understanding of Anunnaki authority and protection. The astronomical texts are particularly fascinating, combining careful empirical observations with sophisticated mathematical analysis and theological interpretation. Mesopotamian astronomers compiled detailed records of planetary movements, eclipse cycles, and stellar positions that allowed them to develop predictive models of unprecedented accuracy. These models were used not only for calendar keeping and agricultural planning, but also for astrological consultation that guided political and personal decision-making. The astrological consultation texts reveal how ordinary Mesopotamians understood their relationship with the Anunnaki in practical terms. Rather than seeking mystical union or transcendent experience, people approached the Anunnaki as they would approach government officials, requesting specific assistance with concrete problems and offering appropriate compensation for services rendered. A typical consultation might involve a merchant seeking divine protection for a trading expedition, a farmer requesting favourable weather for his crops, or a young woman asking for help in finding a suitable husband. The priest would consult astronomical charts and ritual texts to determine which Anunnaki deity had jurisdiction over the particular request, what offerings would be appropriate, and what ritual procedures should be followed to ensure the petition was properly presented. This bureaucratic approach to divine relationship reflects the practical Mesopotamian understanding that the universe operates according to orderly principles that can be understood and worked with through proper procedures. The Anunnaki were not capricious supernatural beings, but were reliable administrators who responded predictably to properly formulated requests, supported by appropriate offerings and correct ritual procedures. The offerings themselves were carefully regulated according to detailed schedules that specified what types of food, drink, incense, and manufactured goods should be presented to each deity on different occasions. The temple staff included specialized priests whose sole responsibility was managing these offerings, ensuring that each deity received proper recognition and sustenance according to their rank and function within the divine hierarchy. The economic impact of these offering systems was substantial. Temple complexes consumed enormous quantities of grain, meat, oil, beer, textiles, and precious metals in daily rituals that fed and clothed the statues of the Anunnaki deities. But these offerings were not simply destroyed in ceremonial consumption. They were redistributed through complex systems that provided food and materials for temple staff, educational institutions, public works projects, and charity for the needy. This redistribution system created a form of social insurance that helped stabilize Mesopotamian society during periods of crop failure, economic disruption, or military conflict. The temples served as repositories of wealth that could be drawn upon during emergencies, while also providing regular employment for thousands of people in religious, administrative and craft occupations that were less vulnerable to economic fluctuations than agricultural work. The stability provided by these religious institutions helps explain how Mesopotamian civilization maintained continuity across so many centuries of political change. While kings and dynasties rose and fell, the temple complexes and their associated educational, economic and social service systems provided institutional frameworks that transcended particular political arrangements. The adaptability of the Anunnaki religious system to changing political circumstances is evident in how the pantheon evolved to accommodate the gods and religious practices of conquered peoples. Rather than simply imposing their own deities on subject populations, successful Mesopotamian empires typically incorporated foreign gods into the Anunnaki hierarchy, finding theological justifications for treating local deities as aspects or servants of established Anunnaki figures. This syncretistic approach created a remarkably inclusive religious system that could accommodate diverse cultural traditions while maintaining overall coherence through the organizing principle of divine bureaucracy. Local communities could continue worshipping their traditional deities while also participating in empire-wide religious observances that reinforced political unity and cultural identity. The theological sophistication required for these syncretistic accommodations is evident in texts that explore the relationships between different divine names and attributes. Mesopotamian scholars developed elaborate theories about how the same divine principles could be manifested through different cultural forms, allowing for religious diversity within cosmic unity. These theological developments influenced later religious traditions throughout the ancient world. The Jewish concept of angels as divine messengers with specialized functions clearly derives from the Anunnaki model of divine bureaucracy. The Christian understanding of saints as intercessors with particular areas of expertise shows similar organizational principles. Even Islamic theology, with its emphasis on divine names and attributes, reflects intellectual frameworks first developed in Mesopotamian discussions of Anunnaki functions and relationships. The influence of Mesopotamian religious concepts on later traditions was transmitted through multiple channels. Direct cultural contact through trade, diplomacy and conquest exposed foreign peoples to Anunnaki, worship practices and theological ideas. But the influence also spread through the adoption of Mesopotamian educational methods and literary traditions by other cultures. The scribal schools that preserved Anunnaki traditions also taught mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law to students from throughout the ancient Middle East. These students returned to their home communities carrying not only practical knowledge, but also the intellectual frameworks and cultural assumptions that had shaped their education. Over time, these transplanted ideas took root in foreign soil and developed into new religious and philosophical traditions that maintained recognizable connections to their Mesopotamian origins. The process of cultural transmission was gradual and often indirect, making it difficult to trace specific influences without careful scholarly analysis. But the cumulative impact was enormous, shaping the development of civilization throughout the region and eventually influencing intellectual traditions that spread across the entire ancient world. The astronomical knowledge developed in Anunnaki-related temple schools, for example, provided the foundation for later Greek mathematical astronomy, which in turn influenced Islamic scientific traditions and eventually contributed to the scientific revolution in early modern Europe. The legal principles encoded in Mesopotamian law collections influenced legal development throughout the ancient Middle East and contributed to the formation of legal traditions that continue to shape contemporary jurisprudence. The literary techniques developed for recording and interpreting Anunnaki myths and hymns established narrative conventions that influenced epic poetry, historical writing, and religious literature throughout antiquity. The organizational principles embedded in descriptions of divine hierarchy influenced political theory and administrative practice in kingdoms and empires across the ancient world. But perhaps the most profound influence of the Anunnaki tradition was its demonstration that complex urban civilizations could maintain stability and continuity across many centuries through effective integration of religious, educational, economic, and administrative institutions. The Mesopotamian achievement in creating sustainable urban societies provided a template that other cultures adapted to their own circumstances throughout the ancient world. This template included not only specific institutional arrangements, but also underlying principles about the relationship between individual and community, temporal and eternal, practical and spiritual concerns. The Mesopotamian insight that these apparently contradictory aspects of human experience could be unified through religious institutions that addressed both material and psychological needs became a foundation stone of civilized society. The temple complexes dedicated to the Anunnaki demonstrated how religious institutions could serve simultaneously as centers of worship, education, economic production, social services, and cultural preservation. This integration of functions created resilient institutions that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential services that urban populations required for survival and prosperity. The longevity of Mesopotamian civilization, which maintained recognizable continuity for over 3,000 years despite countless political upheavals, testifies to the effectiveness of this integrated approach to social organization. The Anunnaki religious system provided not just spiritual guidance, but also practical frameworks for managing the complex social and economic relationships that urban life requires. Modern urban societies face many of the same challenges that confronted the first Mesopotamian cities: how to coordinate the activities of thousands or millions of people living in close proximity, how to manage resources fairly and efficiently, how to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations, how to maintain social cohesion in the face of cultural diversity and economic inequality. The solutions developed by Mesopotamian civilization may not be directly applicable to contemporary circumstances, but their underlying principles remain relevant. The integration of practical and spiritual concerns, the importance of educational institutions in preserving cultural continuity, the value of inclusive approaches to cultural diversity, and the necessity of institutional frameworks that can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential functions all remain crucial elements of successful urban societies. The Anunnaki tradition offers particularly valuable insights into how religious and cultural institutions can provide stability and meaning in the face of rapid social change. The ability of this tradition to evolve and adapt while maintaining recognizable core elements across 5 millennia demonstrates the potential for human institutions to achieve both flexibility and continuity when properly designed and maintained. Understanding how the Mesopotamians achieved this balance between innovation and tradition could inform contemporary efforts to address the challenges of globalization, technological change, and cultural fragmentation that characterize modern society. The Anunnaki religious system provides a historical example of how diverse communities can maintain their distinctive identities while participating in larger networks of cooperation and mutual support. The theological sophistication of the Anunnaki tradition also offers resources for contemporary discussions about the relationship between religious faith and rational inquiry. The Mesopotamian integration of empirical observation, mathematical analysis, and symbolic interpretation in fields like astronomy and medicine demonstrates that scientific and religious approaches to understanding reality need not be mutually exclusive. The Mesopotamian scholar priests who developed increasingly accurate astronomical models while maintaining their religious interpretation of celestial phenomena as divine communication exemplify an approach to knowledge that honors both rational investigation and symbolic meaning. Their example suggests possibilities for dialogue between scientific and religious perspectives that could enrich both domains of human understanding. The environmental challenges that ultimately contributed to the decline of Mesopotamian civilization also provide cautionary lessons for contemporary society. The irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible gradually led to soil salinization that reduced agricultural productivity and forced the abandonment of many settlements. The deforestation required to fuel urban growth contributed to erosion and climate change that made the region increasingly arid and difficult to inhabit. These environmental problems were not simply natural disasters, but were consequences of human activities that seemed beneficial in the short term, but proved destructive over longer time periods. The Mesopotamian experience demonstrates the importance of considering long-term environmental consequences when developing technologies and economic systems, a lesson that remains highly relevant in an era of global climate change and resource depletion. The gradual decline of Mesopotamian civilization was not sudden collapse, but rather a slow transformation, as environmental problems, political instability, and economic disruption made traditional ways of life increasingly difficult to maintain. Many communities adapted by developing new technologies, relocating to more favourable environments, or modifying their cultural practices to fit changed circumstances. The resilience that many Mesopotamian communities displayed in the face of these challenges reflects the adaptability built into their cultural institutions, particularly their religious traditions. The Anunnaki religious system had evolved continuously throughout its history, demonstrating that cultural continuity does not require resistance to change, but rather requires effective mechanisms for adapting traditional wisdom to new circumstances. This adaptability allowed elements of Mesopotamian culture, including aspects of Anunnaki tradition, to survive long after the political collapse of the last Mesopotamian empires. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities in rural areas of Iraq and Iran continued to practice traditional religious observances based on Anunnaki worship well into the medieval period, nearly a millennium after the formal end of cuneiform literacy and organized temple worship. The persistence of these traditions in folk practices and local customs demonstrates the deep cultural roots that 5 millennia of continuous development had established. While the sophisticated theological and astronomical traditions maintained by the temple schools were lost when those institutions disappeared, the basic insights about divine order, cosmic hierarchy, and human responsibility that the Anunnaki represented continued to influence popular culture in more simplified forms. Traces of these influences can still be detected in the folklore, religious practices, and cultural assumptions of Middle Eastern communities today. Traditional blessing formulas, protective rituals, and seasonal celebrations in many parts of Iraq, Syria, and Iran preserve elements that scholars have traced back to ancient Mesopotamian religious practices centered on Anunnaki worship. The survival of these cultural elements across such vast spans of time illustrates the profound impact that the Anunnaki tradition had on the development of human civilization in the Middle East and beyond. Like underground streams that continue to flow long after the visible rivers that fed them have dried up, aspects of Mesopotamian religious culture continue to nourish human communities in ways that are often unconscious, but nonetheless real. This hidden continuity reminds us that cultural influence operates on timescales much longer than political or economic history. While the kingdoms and empires that patronized Anunnaki worship have long since vanished, the intellectual and spiritual insights developed within that tradition continue to shape human understanding in subtle but significant ways. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization through archaeological excavation and cuneiform decipherment during the past 2 centuries has made these hidden influences visible once again, allowing contemporary audiences to appreciate the sophistication and relevance of ancient wisdom and traditions that had been largely forgotten by the modern world. This rediscovery has coincided with growing recognition that modern technological civilization faces challenges similar to those that confronted the ancient Mesopotamians. How to manage complex urban societies, how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how to preserve cultural wisdom while adapting to rapid change, how to develop sustainable relationships with natural environments. The Anunnaki tradition offers no simple answers to these contemporary challenges, but it does provide historical perspective on how previous human societies have addressed similar problems. The longevity and adaptability of Mesopotamian civilization demonstrates that sustainable solutions are possible, while the environmental problems that contributed to its decline provide warnings about approaches that may seem successful in the short term but prove destructive over longer periods. Perhaps most importantly, the Anunnaki tradition exemplifies the human capacity to create meaning and order through cultural institutions that integrate practical and spiritual concerns. The Mesopotamian achievement in developing religious systems that simultaneously addressed material needs and existential questions provides a model for how contemporary societies might approach the task of creating institutions that serve both body and soul. The bureaucratic imagery that characterized Anunnaki mythology may seem prosaic to modern audiences accustomed to more romantic or mystical religious language, but this practical approach to divinity reflects a mature understanding of how spiritual and material concerns can be integrated in daily life. The Mesopotamian insight that sacred and secular activities are not separate spheres, but are different aspects of unified human existence remains relevant for contemporary efforts to create meaningful and sustainable ways of life. As we drift deeper into the rhythms of ancient time, let the measured pace of millennia slow your breathing and quiet your thoughts. The Anunnaki existed in geological time, their influence measured not in years or decades but in centuries and epochs. Their stories unfold with the patience of mountains forming, of rivers carving their channels, of civilizations rising and transforming with the slow majesty of natural processes. The temple complexes where they were worshipped have returned to dust, but the questions they embodied about order and chaos, authority and freedom, individual destiny and cosmic purpose continue to resonate in every human heart that seeks meaning in existence. The cuneiform tablets that preserved their stories have crumbled, but the wisdom those stories contained about how to live in community with others, how to balance competing needs and desires, how to find purpose in the face of uncertainty, remains as fresh and relevant as if it were inscribed yesterday. In the approaching silence of sleep, these ancient rhythms of questioning and searching provide a foundation deeper than consciousness, more reliable than memory, more enduring than any individual life. The Anunnaki offer not escape from human complexity, but fuller participation in the ongoing human project of creating meaning from mystery, order from chaos, beauty from the raw materials of existence. Let the gentle current of 5,000 years carry your awareness into deeper currents of rest and renewal. In dreams, the boundaries between ancient and modern, individual and universal, mortal and eternal, dissolve into the vast patient breathing of time itself. The Anunnaki become not historical curiosities but living symbols of humanity's eternal dialogue with the mystery of being conscious in a universe that seems both utterly foreign and intimately familiar. Their bureaucratic heaven mirrors our earthly institutions, their divine hierarchies reflect our social organizations, their theological questions echo our philosophical puzzles because they were created by humans like ourselves, grappling with the same fundamental challenges of existence that we face today. In recognizing their humanity, we also recognize our connection to the long chain of human seeking and searching that began when our ancestors first looked up at the stars and wondered about their meaning. Tonight, that wondering continues in your own consciousness as it gradually releases its hold on immediate concerns and drifts into the deeper mysteries that sleep makes accessible. The Anunnaki endure not as supernatural beings, but as enduring symbols of the human capacity to find meaning in complexity, to create order from confusion, to discover beauty in the midst of uncertainty. In sleep, we join their eternal conversation about what it means to be human in a universe that offers no easy answers, but abundant opportunities for wonder, growth, and discovery. Their 5,000-year dialogue becomes our dialogue. Their patient exploration of existence becomes our own gentle journey into the healing darkness where consciousness rests and renews itself for another day of questioning, seeking, and finding glimpses of meaning in the magnificent ongoing mystery of being alive. The individual personalities and stories of specific Anunnaki deities reveal the psychological sophistication of Mesopotamian religious thought. Each major deity embodied particular aspects of human experience, while simultaneously representing cosmic forces that governed natural phenomena. This dual nature allowed worshippers to relate to the Anunnaki both as personal protectors and as explanations for the mysterious workings of the universe. Inanna, known in Akkadian as Ishtar, exemplifies this complexity in her role as goddess of both love and warfare. These seemingly contradictory domains made perfect sense to the Mesopotamians, who understood that both love and war involve intense emotions, strategic thinking, and the willingness to take risks for desired outcomes. Inanna's myths explore the connections between desire and aggression, between creation and destruction, between the need for intimacy and the drive for dominance that characterize human relationships at all levels. The most famous of Inanna's stories, her descent to the underworld, functions simultaneously as a fertility myth, explaining seasonal change, and as a psychological allegory about the necessity of confronting darkness and death to achieve wisdom and maturity. In the story, Inanna journeys to the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, but must pass through 7 gates, surrendering an item of clothing or jewelry at each gate until she arrives naked and powerless before her sister's throne. Ereshkigal, who represents the aspects of feminine power that patriarchal societies often suppress or fear, kills Inanna and hangs her corpse on a hook for 3 days. During Inanna's absence from the upper world, all fertility ceases, crops fail, animals do not mate, and humans lose interest in love and procreation. The other Anunnaki must intervene to restore cosmic balance by negotiating Inanna's return to life, but she can only return if someone else takes her place in the underworld. The story's resolution is complex and morally ambiguous. Inanna's consort Dumuzi, who failed to mourn her death appropriately, is chosen as her replacement, but his sister Geshtinanna offers to share his burden, spending half the year in the underworld so that Dumuzi can spend half the year in the upper world. This arrangement explains the seasonal cycle, but also suggests that death and renewal, presence and absence, joy and sorrow are inseparable aspects of existence that must be accepted rather than avoided. The psychological insight embedded in this ancient story rivals the sophistication of modern depth psychology. The recognition that individual growth requires confronting the shadow aspects of personality, that creativity emerges from engagement with destructive forces, and that meaningful relationships require accepting both light and dark aspects of human nature, demonstrates a level of psychological understanding that took Western psychology millennia to rediscover. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, represents a different aspect of Anunnaki psychology, embodying the creative intelligence that solves problems through cunning and innovation rather than through force or authority. Unlike Enlil, who maintains cosmic order through the exercise of legitimate authority, Enki operates through cleverness and lateral thinking, finding unexpected solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The flood narrative provides the clearest example of Enki's character and methods. When the other Anunnaki decide to destroy humanity through a great flood, Enki disagrees with this decision but cannot openly oppose it without challenging divine authority. Instead, he finds an ingenious workaround by speaking to the wall of the house, where the human hero Utnapishtim lives, technically warning the wall rather than directly warning a human being. This subtle distinction allows Enki to save humanity, while maintaining the appearance of obedience to divine decree. Utnapishtim, overhearing Enki's warning to the wall, builds an ark and survives the flood with his family and representatives of all living species. When the flood subsides and the other Anunnaki discover that humans have survived, they are initially angry at Enki's deception, but eventually recognize the wisdom of his actions. The story suggests that rigid adherence to authority, even divine authority, may sometimes be less moral than creative disobedience that serves higher principles. Enki represents the aspect of wisdom that questions established procedures when they produce harmful results, seeking alternative approaches that achieve better outcomes even when such alternatives require challenging conventional thinking. This theme of beneficial rule-breaking appears throughout Mesopotamian literature and reflects a sophisticated understanding of the tension between order and innovation in human societies. While the Mesopotamians valued institutional stability and respected legitimate authority, they also recognized that progress requires individuals willing to think beyond established parameters and find new solutions to persistent problems. The character of Enki also embodies the Mesopotamian understanding of the relationship between human intelligence and natural forces. As god of fresh water, Enki controls the underground aquifers that feed springs and wells, the rivers that make agriculture possible, and the rainfall that determines crop success. But as god of wisdom, he also represents the human intelligence that learns to work with these natural forces through engineering, planning, and technological innovation. This integration of practical and intellectual capabilities in a single deity reflects the Mesopotamian recognition that survival and prosperity require both technical skill and theoretical understanding. The irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian civilization possible required not only engineering expertise to design and build canals and levees, but also mathematical knowledge to calculate water flow rates, astronomical observations to predict seasonal flooding, and administrative skills to coordinate the labour of thousands of workers across multiple communities. Enki's association with craftsmanship and technological innovation made him patron deity of the scribble schools where these various skills were taught and developed. Students learning to read and write cuneiform script would begin their studies by copying hymns and prayers dedicated to Enki, invoking his blessing on their efforts to master the complex intellectual and technical skills that advanced literacy required. The curriculum of these schools reveals the breadth of knowledge that educated Mesopotamians were expected to master. Beyond basic literacy and numeracy, students studied astronomy, medicine, law, engineering, music, and theology in programs that could last for decades, and produce scholar administrators capable of managing the complex institutions that urban civilization required. The astronomical component of this education was particularly sophisticated, requiring students to master mathematical techniques for calculating planetary positions, predicting eclipses, and maintaining accurate calendar systems. The astronomical knowledge preserved in cuneiform texts demonstrates observational precision and theoretical sophistication that would not be surpassed until the development of telescopic astronomy in early modern Europe. The medical training included both practical knowledge about anatomy, surgery, and pharmaceutical preparations, and theoretical understanding of disease as disruption of cosmic harmony that required both physical treatment and ritual intervention. Mesopotamian medical texts describe surgical procedures, diagnostic techniques, and pharmaceutical preparations that demonstrate considerable practical effectiveness, while also incorporating religious elements that addressed the psychological and social dimensions of illness and healing. The legal education prepared students to serve as judges and administrators in court systems that handled both civil and criminal cases according to written law codes that specified procedures and penalties in remarkable detail. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to the 18th century BCE, contains nearly 300 specific legal provisions covering everything from property rights and commercial contracts to family relationships and criminal justice. These law codes were not merely practical administrative tools, but were also theological documents that explained how human justice reflected divine order. The prologue to Hammurabi's code describes the king as chosen by Marduk to establish justice on earth, while the epilogue promises divine punishment for anyone who alters or ignores the legal provisions. This integration of practical law and religious authority created legal systems that combined pragmatic effectiveness with moral legitimacy in ways that influenced legal development throughout the ancient world. The artistic and architectural traditions associated with Anunnaki worship demonstrate another dimension of Mesopotamian cultural sophistication. The monumental sculptures, relief carvings, and architectural decorations found in temple complexes represent artistic achievements that rival the greatest works of any ancient civilization, while also serving as complex theological texts that communicated religious concepts through visual imagery. The famous relief sculptures from the palace of Sargon II at Khorsabad, dating to the 8th century BCE, depict Anunnaki deities as monumental figures with carefully detailed attributes that identify their specific functions and areas of authority. These sculptures served not merely as decoration, but as visual encyclopedias that educated viewers about the structure of divine hierarchy and the proper relationships between human and divine authority. The architectural spaces designed for Anunnaki worship were equally sophisticated, incorporating acoustic principles that enhanced the effectiveness of religious ceremonies, lighting systems that created dramatic visual effects during ritual observances, and circulation patterns that controlled access to sacred spaces while accommodating large numbers of participants in public festivals. The Great Throne Room in the Palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, rebuilt during the Neo-Babylonian period around 600 BCE, exemplifies this architectural sophistication. The room was designed to overwhelm visitors with its scale and decorative richness, while also creating intimate spaces where smaller groups could engage in more personal religious activities. The famous Ishtar Gate, decorated with brilliant blue-glazed bricks and relief sculptures of dragons and bulls representing various Anunnaki deities, served as both defensive architecture and religious art, protecting the city while also proclaiming the divine authority that legitimized royal power. The seasonal festivals that structured Mesopotamian religious life provide another window into the practical operation of Anunnaki worship and its social functions. The New Year festival, called Akitu, was the most elaborate of these celebrations, lasting 11 days and involving the entire population of major cities in ceremonial activities that reenacted the creation of the world and renewed the covenant between gods and humans for the coming year. The Akitu festival began with ritual purification of temples and the recitation of the Enuma Elish creation epic, followed by elaborate processions in which statues of the Anunnaki deities were carried through the streets of the city and then transported by boat to a special festival house outside the city walls. During this journey, the king underwent ritual humiliation and renewal, surrendering his crown and royal regalia to the high priest of Marduk, who would strike the king's cheek and pull his ears before returning his royal symbols and confirming his divine mandate to rule for another year. These ritual activities served multiple functions simultaneously. At the religious level, they reenacted mythological events that maintained cosmic order and ensured divine blessing for the coming year. At the political level, they renewed the legitimacy of royal authority, while also providing opportunities for the king to demonstrate his humility before divine power. At the social level, they created shared experiences that reinforced community identity and provided occasions for economic exchange, artistic performance, and cultural celebration. The economic impact of these festivals was enormous, drawing visitors from throughout the empire and generating income for merchants, craftsmen, performers, and service providers. The temple complexes coordinated these activities, managing the logistics of housing and feeding thousands of visitors, while also organizing the religious ceremonies and ensuring adequate supplies of food, drink, and ceremonial materials for the extended celebrations. Archaeological evidence from festival sites reveals the scale and complexity of these operations. Excavations at the Akitu house outside Babylon have uncovered enormous kitchens capable of preparing food for thousands of people, storage facilities for the vast quantities of grain, oil, and wine consumed during the celebrations, and workshop areas where craftsmen produced the ceremonial objects used in religious rituals. The international character of these festivals is evident in artifacts and texts that document the participation of visitors from throughout the Mesopotamian world and beyond. Diplomatic correspondence from various periods describes foreign rulers sending ambassadors to participate in major festivals, both as expressions of religious devotion and as opportunities for political negotiation and economic cooperation. The role of women in Anunnaki worship was complex and varied according to social status, historical period, and regional traditions. Unlike many ancient religious systems that restricted women's participation to domestic or marginal roles, Mesopotamian religion included significant opportunities for women to serve in important religious offices and to participate in theological development and ritual innovation. The most prominent female religious office was that of the Entu priestess, a position that could only be held by women of royal or noble birth who were dedicated to the service of particular Anunnaki deities. The Entu priestess of Inanna in the city of Uruk, for example, was one of the most powerful religious figures in the Sumerian world, controlling vast temple estates and wielding considerable political influence through her role as the human representative of the goddess. These priestesses were not merely passive servants of male-dominated religious hierarchies, but were active theologians and ritual innovators who contributed significantly to the development of Mesopotamian religious thought. The hymns and prayers composed by the Entu priestess Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad in the 23rd century BCE, are among the earliest known works of literature by a named author and demonstrate sophisticated theological reflection on the nature of divine power and human relationship with the cosmos. Enheduanna's compositions reveal a complex understanding of the psychological and social functions of religious experience. Her hymns to Inanna explore themes of divine possession, ecstatic experience, and the transformation of consciousness that occurs through intense religious devotion. But they also address practical concerns about the management of temple resources, the resolution of political conflicts, and the maintenance of social order during periods of upheaval. The survival of Enheduanna's works for over 4,000 years, copied and recopied by generations of scribes long after the political circumstances that inspired them had been forgotten, testifies to the enduring power and relevance of her theological insights. Her influence on later Mesopotamian religious literature was profound, establishing literary and theological conventions that shaped religious writing throughout the ancient Middle East. Other categories of female religious practitioners included the Naditu, celibate priestesses who managed temple estates and engaged in business activities that supported religious institutions, and the Kadishtu, sacred prostitutes whose ritual activities were understood as forms of worship that maintained cosmic fertility and ensured divine blessing for the community. The institution of sacred prostitution, while often misunderstood by modern audiences, served important social and religious functions in Mesopotamian society. The Kadishtu were not marginalized figures, but were respected religious practitioners whose activities were considered essential for maintaining the cosmic balance that ensured agricultural fertility, human reproduction, and social harmony. The theological understanding underlying sacred prostitution was that sexual activity, when properly ritualized and dedicated to appropriate deities, participated in the creative forces that maintain the universe. The union between divine and human realms that was symbolically enacted through ritual intercourse was understood as essential for preventing the cosmic forces of chaos and sterility from overwhelming the ordered world that civilization required. This integration of sexuality and spirituality reflects a holistic approach to human experience that contrasts sharply with the body-spirit dualism that characterizes many later religious traditions. The Mesopotamians understood sexual desire not as a distraction from spiritual development, but as a fundamental aspect of the creative energy that drives all existence and connects individual experience to cosmic processes. The gradual decline of sacred prostitution and other goddess-centered religious practices during the first millennium BCE reflects broader changes in Mesopotamian society as patriarchal social structures became more rigid and foreign cultural influences, particularly from Persian and Greek sources, introduced different attitudes towards sexuality and gender roles. The transformation of Anunnaki worship during the Persian period demonstrates the adaptability of Mesopotamian religious traditions, while also revealing the pressures that eventually led to their decline. Persian rulers generally followed a policy of religious tolerance that allowed local communities to maintain their traditional practices, but they also promoted Zoroastrian religious concepts that emphasized the struggle between good and evil forces and the ultimate triumph of a single supreme deity. These Zoroastrian influences can be detected in late Babylonian religious texts that show increasing emphasis on moral dualism, divine judgment, and eschatological concerns about the fate of the soul after death. While these themes were not entirely foreign to earlier Mesopotamian religious thought, their prominence in Persian period texts suggests significant theological development under foreign influence. The Greek conquest of Mesopotamia by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE brought different but equally significant changes to Anunnaki worship. Greek rulers were generally more interventionist than their Persian predecessors, actively promoting Greek cultural institutions and religious practices, while also seeking to identify Greek gods with local deities through syncretistic interpretation. The identification of Anunnaki deities with Greek gods created new theological possibilities but also led to significant simplification of the complex divine hierarchies that had characterized earlier Mesopotamian religion. Marduk was identified with Zeus, Ishtar with Aphrodite, and Nabu with Hermes, but these identifications flattened the distinctive characteristics that had made each Anunnaki deity unique. The Seleucid period, lasting from 312 to 63 BCE, represents the final flowering of traditional Mesopotamian culture as local scholars worked to preserve ancient religious and intellectual traditions while also engaging with Greek philosophical and scientific ideas. The astronomical texts produced during this period represent the culmination of nearly 3 millennia of Mesopotamian observational astronomy, incorporating Greek geometric methods with traditional Babylonian computational techniques to create mathematical models of unprecedented accuracy. These late astronomical texts demonstrate the continuing vitality of Mesopotamian intellectual traditions, even as the broader culture was being transformed by foreign influences. The scholars who produced these texts were deeply versed in traditional Anunnaki mythology and religious practice, but they were also familiar with Greek mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy, creating synthetic approaches that combined the best elements of both traditions. The gradual Christianization of the Middle East during the Roman period created the final challenge to traditional Anunnaki worship. Unlike earlier foreign influences that had been incorporated through syncretistic adaptation, Christianity demanded exclusive allegiance that was incompatible with the polytheistic flexibility that had allowed Anunnaki worship to survive previous cultural changes. Yet even the triumph of Christianity did not completely eliminate Anunnaki influences from Middle Eastern culture. Christian theological development in the region shows clear traces of earlier Mesopotamian religious concepts, particularly in the areas of angelology, eschatology, and liturgical practice. The hierarchical organization of angelic beings in Christian theology clearly derives from the bureaucratic structure of the Anunnaki pantheon, while Christian ideas about divine judgment and the resurrection of the dead incorporate elements from much older Mesopotamian traditions. The survival of Mesopotamian cultural elements in Christian contexts demonstrates the profound influence that 5 millennia of Anunnaki-centered civilization had on the fundamental structures of Middle Eastern thought. Even when the explicit worship of Anunnaki deities ceased, the intellectual and cultural frameworks they had created continued to shape how people in the region understood the relationship between human and divine realms. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization through archaeological excavation during the 19th and 20th centuries revealed the full scope of this cultural influence for the first time since antiquity. The decipherment of cuneiform script and the excavation of major Mesopotamian cities provided access to thousands of years of religious, literary and administrative texts that had been buried and forgotten for over a millennium. This rediscovery has coincided with growing recognition of the sophistication and relevance of ancient Middle Eastern cultures that had previously been dismissed as primitive or superseded by later Greek and Roman achievements. The Mesopotamian contributions to mathematics, astronomy, law, literature and urban planning are now recognized as foundational developments that made later achievements possible. The Anunnaki religious system, understood in its historical and cultural context, provides valuable insights into how human communities can create meaningful and sustainable ways of life through the integration of practical and spiritual concerns. The longevity and adaptability of Mesopotamian civilization demonstrates that religious traditions can serve not only individual spiritual needs, but also broader social functions that contribute to community resilience and cultural continuity. The bureaucratic imagery that characterizes Anunnaki mythology may seem prosaic to modern audiences accustomed to more romantic or mystical religious language, but this practical approach to divinity reflects a mature understanding of how spiritual and material concerns can be integrated in daily life. The Mesopotamian insight that sacred and secular activities are not separate spheres, but are different aspects of unified human existence remains relevant for contemporary efforts to create holistic approaches to personal and community development. As the deep currents of ancient time carry us further into the realm of sleep and dreams, let the measured rhythms of 5,000 years of human questioning and seeking provide a foundation for rest and renewal. The Anunnaki existed in the slow time of civilizations rising and transforming, their influence measured not in the brief spans of individual lives, but in the patient accumulation of wisdom across generations and centuries. The questions they embodied about order and freedom, authority and responsibility, individual purpose and cosmic meaning continue to resonate in every human heart that seeks to understand its place in the larger patterns of existence. The answers they offered were not final solutions, but rather better ways of living with mystery, more skillful methods of creating meaning from uncertainty, more effective strategies for building communities that could endure and adapt across vast changes in circumstances. Their divine bureaucracy mirrors our earthly institutions not because they were literally supernatural administrators, but because they were created by humans like ourselves, wrestling with the same fundamental challenges of social organization that we face today. In their careful hierarchies and specialized functions, we see reflected our own efforts to create institutional frameworks that can coordinate complex activities while remaining responsive to individual needs and changing circumstances. The temple complexes where they were worshipped have long since returned to dust, but the conversations they housed about how to live meaningfully in community with others continue in every human gathering that takes seriously the challenge of creating just and sustainable ways of life. The cuneiform tablets that preserved their stories have crumbled, but the wisdom those stories encoded about the integration of practical and spiritual concerns remains as relevant today as when it was first inscribed in clay. In the gentle darkness of approaching sleep, these ancient rhythms of reflection and questioning provide currents deeper than individual consciousness, more reliable than personal memory, more enduring than any single lifetime. The Anunnaki become not historical curiosities, but living symbols of humanity's eternal dialogue with the mystery of conscious existence in a universe that offers infinite opportunities for wonder, growth, and discovery. Let their 5,000-year conversation carry your awareness into the deeper mysteries that sleep makes accessible, where the boundaries between past and present, individual and universal, mortal and eternal, dissolve into the vast, patient breathing of time itself. In dreams, we join their eternal dialogue not as outside observers, but as integral participants in the ongoing human project of creating meaning from mystery, finding purpose in complexity, and discovering glimpses of the sacred in the midst of ordinary existence. Their patient exploration of cosmic order becomes our own gentle journey into the healing darkness where consciousness rests and renews itself, gathering strength for another day of questioning, seeking, and finding fragments of meaning in the magnificent, inexhaustible mystery of being human in an endlessly fascinating universe. The technological innovations that emerge from Anunnaki-centered temple complexes demonstrate how religious devotion and practical problem-solving reinforced each other throughout Mesopotamian history. The wheel, one of humanity's most transformative inventions, was first developed not for transportation, but for pottery making in temple workshops dedicated to the goddess Ninhursag, whose domain included the clay from which both pots and human beings were fashioned according to Mesopotamian creation myths. The religious significance of clay in Mesopotamian thought extended far beyond its practical utility as a material for making vessels and tablets. Clay represented the primordial substance from which the Anunnaki had fashioned human beings, making pottery production a sacred activity that participated in the ongoing creation of the world. The potter's wheel, spinning clay into perfect circular forms, embodied cosmic principles of order and harmony that temple artisans understood as reflections of divine creativity. The mathematical precision required for creating functional pottery led to advances in geometry and measurement that found applications throughout Mesopotamian civilization. The techniques developed for calculating the volumes of vessels became the foundation for architectural engineering, agricultural planning, and commercial accounting systems that supported increasingly complex urban societies. The sexagesimal number system, based on multiples of 60, emerged from practical needs in temple workshops and administrative offices, but encoded profound theological concepts about the structure of cosmic time and space. The decision to divide circles into 360 degrees, hours into 60 minutes, and minutes into 60 seconds reflected not arbitrary mathematical choices but religious understanding of how divine order manifested in geometric relationships that could be calculated and applied. This integration of practical mathematics with cosmic symbolism characterizes Mesopotamian approaches to technology throughout their long history. Every innovation, from the development of metallurgy to the construction of irrigation systems, was understood simultaneously as human achievement and as participation in divine creativity that maintained and enhanced the ordered world the Anunnaki had established. The bronze-working techniques developed in temple workshops demonstrate this integration particularly clearly. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that requires sophisticated knowledge of metallurgy to produce successfully, was first developed for creating ritual objects and divine statues rather than for practical tools or weapons. The religious significance of bronze lay in its combination of two different metals into a substance superior to either component alone, symbolizing the union of earthly and celestial realms that the Anunnaki represented. The technical knowledge required for bronze production involved understanding temperature control, alloy ratios, and casting techniques that pushed the boundaries of available technology. Temple metalworkers developed furnace designs capable of reaching temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius, created sophisticated mold systems for casting complex shapes, and refined purification techniques that produced bronze of exceptional quality and durability. These metallurgical advances had profound economic and military implications that shaped the development of Mesopotamian civilization. Superior bronze weapons gave Mesopotamian armies advantages over enemies using stone or copper implements, while bronze agricultural tools increased farming productivity and allowed for the cultivation of previously unusable land. But the religious context in which these technologies developed ensured that their applications remained embedded within ethical and social frameworks that considered broader consequences, rather than simply pursuing maximum efficiency or profit. The temple workshops that controlled advanced metallurgy operated according to religious principles that emphasized community benefit, environmental stewardship, and social responsibility. The irrigation technologies that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible exemplify this integration of technical innovation with religious and social values. The canal systems that channeled river water to agricultural fields required coordination among dozens of communities, sophisticated engineering to maintain proper water flow gradients, and administrative systems capable of managing complex allocation schedules that balanced competing needs fairly. These irrigation networks were understood not merely as human engineering projects, but as earthly manifestations of the cosmic order that Enlil maintained through his control of atmospheric and terrestrial waters. The priests who supervised canal construction and maintenance saw themselves as servants of Enlil, implementing divine will through practical water management that sustained the agricultural productivity upon which civilization depended. The religious framework within which irrigation technology developed created institutional mechanisms for resolving conflicts, maintaining infrastructure, and adapting to changing environmental conditions that proved remarkably durable. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Mesopotamian canal systems operated continuously for over 2 millennia, supported by religious institutions that provided the social cohesion and technical expertise necessary for such long-term maintenance. The astronomical observations that emerge from Anunnaki worship represent perhaps the most sophisticated synthesis of religious devotion and scientific investigation in the ancient world. The identification of planets with specific Anunnaki deities motivated centuries of careful observation that produced mathematical models of planetary motion accurate enough to predict celestial events decades in advance. Venus, identified with Inanna/Ishtar, received particularly intensive study because of the goddess's prominence in Mesopotamian religious life and the planet's dramatic visibility as both morning and evening star. Mesopotamian astronomers compiled detailed records of Venus's synodic cycles, developed mathematical formulas for predicting its appearances and disappearances, and created sophisticated models that accounted for the complex relationships between Venus's orbital period and Earth's calendar year. The precision of these astronomical calculations is remarkable by any standard. Mesopotamian predictions of Venus's position were typically accurate to within a few days over periods of several years, representing observational and mathematical achievement that would not be surpassed until the development of telescopic astronomy in early modern Europe. But this astronomical precision served religious rather than purely scientific purposes. The ability to predict celestial events demonstrated mastery of divine communication systems that the Anunnaki used to convey guidance to human rulers and communities. Priest astronomers who could accurately forecast eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and other significant celestial phenomena wielded enormous political influence because they appeared to have privileged access to divine knowledge. The divination systems based on astronomical observations reveal the sophisticated integration of empirical observation, mathematical calculation, and symbolic interpretation that characterized Mesopotamian intellectual life. Omens were derived not from arbitrary supernatural intervention, but from careful analysis of natural patterns that were understood as expressions of divine will operating through regular, predictable processes. The hepatoscopy, or liver divination, practiced throughout Mesopotamia demonstrates this same integration of careful empirical observation with religious interpretation. Priests who specialized in hepatoscopy developed detailed anatomical knowledge of sheep and goat livers, creating standardized models that identified dozens of specific features whose variations could be interpreted as divine communications about future events. Archaeological excavations have recovered clay models of livers with cuneiform inscriptions indicating the divinatory significance of various anatomical features. These models represent sophisticated attempts to systematize empirical observation and create reproducible interpretative frameworks that could be taught to new practitioners and applied consistently across different contexts. The effectiveness of hepatoscopy as a decision-making tool lay not in supernatural revelation, but in the psychological and social functions it served for individuals and communities facing uncertain choices. The ritual process of hepatoscopy provided structured opportunities for reflection, consultation with trusted advisors, and consideration of alternative courses of action that often led to better decisions regardless of the literal accuracy of specific predictions. The medical practices associated with Anunnaki worship demonstrate similar integration of empirical observation, practical treatment, and religious interpretation. Mesopotamian medical texts describe surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques that show considerable practical effectiveness while also incorporating ritual elements designed to address the spiritual dimensions of illness and healing. The goddess Gula, patron deity of healing and medicine, embodied this holistic approach to healthcare that treated physical symptoms as manifestations of broader disruptions in cosmic harmony that required both medical intervention and ritual restoration of proper relationships with divine authority. Physicians who served in temples dedicated to Gula underwent extensive training in anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical techniques, but they also studied theology, ritual practice, and divination methods that allowed them to address the spiritual causes of illness. The pharmaceutical knowledge preserved in Mesopotamian medical texts demonstrates sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry and drug interactions that rivals modern pharmacological knowledge in many areas. Mesopotamian physicians used over 300 different plant materials in their preparations, created complex formulations that addressed multiple symptoms simultaneously, and developed delivery systems that maximized therapeutic effectiveness while minimizing adverse reactions. The preservation of this medical knowledge was facilitated by the same scribal schools that maintained other aspects of Anunnaki tradition, ensuring that medical expertise was transmitted across generations through systematic education rather than merely apprenticeship. This institutional approach to medical education produced physicians whose knowledge was more comprehensive and reliable than would have been possible through informal training methods. The architectural achievements of Mesopotamian civilization, from the great ziggurats to the elaborate palace complexes, represent another domain where religious devotion drove technological innovation that had lasting impact on human culture. The engineering techniques developed for constructing massive religious monuments required advances in mathematics, materials science, and project management that found applications throughout ancient architecture. The ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Nana, exemplifies the sophisticated engineering knowledge that Mesopotamian builders developed for religious purposes. The structure, built around 2100 BCE, incorporated advanced drainage systems that prevented water damage, used bitumen waterproofing that has proved remarkably durable, and employed structural techniques that have allowed the building to survive over 4,000 years of earthquakes, floods, and human conflicts. The construction project required coordinating the work of thousands of labourers over multiple decades, managing the procurement and transportation of millions of bricks and other building materials, and maintaining quality control standards that ensured structural integrity across the enormous scale of the project. The administrative systems developed for managing such complex construction projects became templates for organising other large-scale collective activities throughout Mesopotamian civilization. The artistic traditions associated with Anunnaki worship pushed the boundaries of available materials and techniques, while creating visual vocabularies that influenced artistic development throughout the ancient world. The relief sculptures that decorated temple walls and palace courtyards required sophisticated knowledge of stone carving, metal working, and ceramic production that established technological standards for craftsmanship that endured for millennia. The famous Ishtar Gate of Babylon, reconstructed during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, around 600 BCE, demonstrates the pinnacle of Mesopotamian artistic and technological achievement. The gate's brilliant blue-glazed bricks required mastery of ceramic chemistry that produced colours of unprecedented intensity and durability, while the relief sculptures of dragons and bulls incorporated artistic conventions that had been refined through centuries of religious art production. The iconographic programs decorating these monumental structures served as visual encyclopedias that educated viewers about theological concepts, historical events, and cultural values that defined Mesopotamian civilization. The careful placement of specific divine symbols, the precise rendering of ceremonial activities, and the complex relationships between different decorative elements created visual narratives that communicated sophisticated ideas about cosmic order, political authority, and social responsibility. The musical traditions associated with Anunnaki worship reveal another dimension of Mesopotamian cultural sophistication that influenced artistic development throughout the ancient world. The hymns and liturgical chants preserved in cuneiform texts represent some of humanity's earliest systematic approaches to composition, performance, and music theory that established foundations for later musical traditions. The instruments used in temple ceremonies included harps, lyres, drums, and flutes, whose construction required advanced knowledge of acoustics, materials science, and craftsmanship that produced instruments of exceptional quality and beauty. Archaeological excavations have recovered musical instruments from royal tombs at that demonstrate extraordinary artistic and technical skill, with gold and silver decorations, inlaid precious stones, and structural designs that optimized sound production while creating objects of stunning visual impact. The performance context for this sacred music reveal the central role that artistic expression played in Mesopotamian religious life. Major festivals could involve hundreds of musicians performing complex compositions that required months of preparation and coordination. The texts preserve detailed instructions for choreographic movements, instrumental accompaniments, and vocal techniques that created multimedia presentations of extraordinary scope and sophistication. The educational systems that trained these musicians were integrated with the scribal schools that preserved other aspects of Anunnaki tradition, ensuring that musical knowledge was transmitted through systematic instruction rather than merely informal apprenticeship. Students learned to read musical notation systems, understand theoretical principles of harmony and rhythm, and master performance techniques that required years of dedicated practice. The influence of Mesopotamian musical traditions can be traced through later cultural developments throughout the Middle East and Mediterranean world. The scales, rhythmic patterns, and compositional techniques developed for Anunnaki worship provided foundations for musical traditions that spread through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange to influence the development of music in Greece, Rome, India, and other ancient civilizations. The literary achievements of Mesopotamian civilization, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the vast corpus of hymns, myths, and wisdom literature associated with Anunnaki worship, represent humanity's earliest systematic exploration of fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and human destiny that continue to resonate with contemporary audiences. The sophistication of these literary works lies not merely in their antiquity, but in their psychological insight, artistic craftsmanship, and philosophical depth that rival the greatest works of later literary traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, explores themes of friendship, mortality, the abuse of power, and the search for meaning with psychological subtlety and narrative skill that make it as compelling to modern readers as it was to ancient audiences. The composition and preservation of this literary corpus required institutional support from the temple complexes and scribal schools that maintained Anunnaki traditions across centuries of cultural change. The texts were copied and recopied by generations of scribes who added commentaries, variant readings, and interpretative glosses that enriched the meaning and accessibility of ancient works while preserving their essential content. The diversity of literary genres represented in this corpus demonstrates the cultural richness of Mesopotamian civilization and the central role that written expression played in their intellectual and spiritual life. Epic narratives, lyric poetry, wisdom literature, historical chronicles, legal texts, scientific treatises, and personal letters all contributed to a literary culture of remarkable breadth and sophistication. The influence of Mesopotamian literary traditions on later cultural development was profound and lasting. The flood narrative that appears in Genesis clearly derives from much older Mesopotamian flood stories, while the creation account incorporates elements from Mesopotamian creation myths. The wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible shows clear influences from Mesopotamian predecessors, and even New Testament writings contain echoes of literary themes and narrative techniques first developed in Anunnaki-related texts. The legal traditions preserved in Mesopotamian law codes represent another area where religious devotion drove social innovation that influenced legal development throughout the ancient world. The Code of Hammurabi, presented as a divine revelation from Marduk, established principles of justice, proportionality, and due process that became foundational elements of legal systems throughout the Middle East and Mediterranean world. These legal codes were not merely practical administrative tools, but were also theological documents that explored fundamental questions about justice, authority, and social responsibility. The prologue and epilogue to Hammurabi's code contain sophisticated reflections on the nature of kingship, the source of legal authority, and the relationship between divine and human justice that influenced political theory for millennia. The practical effectiveness of these legal systems depended on institutional frameworks that could enforce legal decisions, maintain records, and adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential principles. The court systems associated with Mesopotamian temples developed procedures for evidence gathering, witness examination, and judicial deliberation that established standards for legal practice that influenced legal development throughout the ancient world. The commercial law preserved in thousands of business documents from Mesopotamian archives reveals the sophisticated economic relationships that supported urban civilization and enabled the cultural achievements that temple institutions made possible. Contracts for land sales, business partnerships, international trade, and financial services demonstrate legal and economic sophistication that rivals modern commercial practice in many areas. The banking and credit systems that emerged from temple economic activities created financial instruments that facilitated long-distance trade, supported agricultural development, and enabled capital formation that funded major construction projects and technological innovations. The mathematical techniques developed for calculating interest, managing currency exchange, and assessing investment risks established foundations for financial analysis that influenced economic development throughout the ancient world. The agricultural innovations that supported Mesopotamian population growth and urban development were deeply embedded within religious frameworks that emphasized environmental stewardship, community cooperation, and sustainable resource management. The festivals and ritual observances that mark the agricultural calendar were not merely ceremonial activities, but were also practical mechanisms for coordinating planting schedules, managing irrigation systems, and distributing agricultural products fairly among community members. The crop rotation systems, seed selection techniques, and soil management practices developed by Mesopotamian farmers demonstrated sophisticated ecological knowledge that maintained agricultural productivity for centuries, while supporting population densities that would not be achieved again in the region until modern times. The religious understanding that the land belonged to the Anunnaki deities rather than to human owners created ethical frameworks that discouraged exploitation and encouraged long-term stewardship. The environmental challenges that eventually contributed to the decline of Mesopotamian civilization were not simply natural disasters, but were consequences of human activities that gradually exceeded the carrying capacity of regional ecosystems. The salinization that reduced agricultural productivity resulted from irrigation practices that, while successful in the short term, led to long-term degradation of soil quality that could not be reversed with available technology. The deforestation that accompanied urban growth and industrial development contributed to erosion, climate change, and desertification that made the region increasingly difficult to inhabit. These environmental problems developed gradually over centuries, making their long-term consequences difficult to recognize until they had become irreversible. The lessons embedded in Mesopotamian environmental history remain highly relevant for contemporary societies facing similar challenges of balancing economic development with ecological sustainability. The Mesopotamian experience demonstrates both the potential for human societies to create sustainable relationships with natural environments and the consequences of exceeding ecological limits through short-term thinking and inadequate attention to long-term impacts. The regional variations in Anunnaki worship across different Mesopotamian city-states reveal the flexibility and adaptability that characterized this religious tradition throughout its long history. While certain core concepts and practices remained consistent across the region, local communities developed distinctive approaches that reflected their particular economic activities, environmental conditions, and cultural preferences. The city of Uruk, for example, developed particularly elaborate festivals honoring Inanna that reflected the city's role as a major center of textile production and long-distance trade. The rituals associated with these festivals incorporated symbolism related to weaving, commerce, and cultural exchange that resonated with the daily experiences of Uruk's population while maintaining connections to broader Mesopotamian religious traditions. The city of Sippar, center of worship for the sun god Shamash, developed legal and administrative innovations that reflected the deity's role as divine judge and guarantor of justice. The court systems and legal procedures associated with Shamash's temple in Sippas became models that were adopted throughout Mesopotamia and influenced legal development throughout the ancient Middle East. These regional variations in religious practice created a rich diversity of approaches to Anunnaki worship that prevented the tradition from becoming rigid or unresponsive to changing circumstances. The ability of local communities to adapt traditional practices to their specific needs, while maintaining connections to broader religious frameworks, contributed significantly to the longevity and cultural influence of Mesopotamian civilization. The trade networks that connected Mesopotamian city-states with communities throughout the ancient world served as channels for religious, as well as commercial exchange that spread Anunnaki-related concepts and practices far beyond their region of origin. Mesopotamian merchants, craftsmen, and administrators carried their religious ideas along with their commercial goods, gradually familiarizing foreign peoples with Mesopotamian approaches to understanding divine authority and cosmic order. The cylinder seals that Mesopotamian merchants used to authenticate documents and secure stored goods often depicted Anunnaki deities and mythological scenes that served as portable religious art, introducing foreign audiences to Mesopotamian theological concepts through visual imagery that transcended linguistic barriers. Archaeological discoveries of Mesopotamian cylinder seals at sites throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe demonstrate the extensive geographical reach of these cultural exchanges. The diplomatic correspondence preserved in various archives reveals how Mesopotamian religious concepts influenced international relations and provided common frameworks for negotiation and cooperation among diverse peoples. The identification of local deities with Anunnaki figures created theological vocabularies that facilitated communication and enabled the development of treaty relationships that transcended cultural differences. As these ancient currents of cultural exchange and religious development carry us deeper into the realm of sleep and contemplation, let the vast scope of 5,000 years of human achievement and adaptation provide perspective on our contemporary challenges and opportunities. The Mesopotamians, who created and maintained Anunnaki traditions, faced problems similar to those confronting modern societies: how to organize complex urban communities, how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how to develop sustainable relationships with natural environments, how to preserve cultural wisdom while adapting to technological and social change. Their solutions were not perfect, and their civilization eventually succumbed to environmental, political, and cultural pressures that exceeded their adaptive capacity. But their achievement in creating institutions that maintained cultural continuity across 50 centuries of change demonstrates the potential for human creativity and cooperation when directed toward constructive purposes. The Anunnaki religious system they developed provided frameworks for integrating practical and spiritual concerns, individual and community needs, temporal and eternal perspectives that enabled them to create one of humanity's most successful and enduring civilizations. The theological sophistication, institutional innovation, and cultural achievements that emerge from their religious devotion continue to influence human societies in ways that are often invisible, but nonetheless profound. In the approaching quiet of sleep, these ancient rhythms of devotion and discovery provide currents deeper than personal consciousness, more reliable than individual memory, more enduring than any single lifetime. The conversations that began in Sumerian temple schools 5,000 years ago continue in every human community that takes seriously the challenge of creating meaningful and sustainable ways of life. The Anunnaki become not historical curiosities, but enduring symbols of humanity's capacity to find sacred meaning in ordinary activities, to create beauty from practical necessity, to discover wisdom through patient observation and reflection. Their bureaucratic heaven reflects not supernatural reality but human recognition that consciousness itself is a form of cosmic administration, organizing experience into patterns that create meaning from chaos and purpose from randomness. Let their patient exploration of cosmic order become your own gentle journey into the deeper mysteries that sleep makes accessible, where individual awareness merges with the universal processes of questioning, seeking, and discovering that drive all growth and change. In dreams, the boundaries between ancient and modern, human and divine, temporal and eternal, dissolve into the vast healing rhythms of existence itself. The great ziggurats have crumbled, but the questions they embodied about how to live meaningfully in relationship with transcendent mystery remain as urgent today as when they were first built from the clay of ancient riverbeds. The cuneiform tablets have returned to dust, but the conversations they preserved about wisdom, justice, beauty, and truth continue in every human heart that wonders about its place in the magnificent, ongoing mystery of conscious existence in an inexhaustibly complex and fascinating universe. The seasonal rhythms that structured Anunnaki worship reveal the profound connections between cosmic cycles and human consciousness that the Mesopotamians understood with remarkable sophistication. The agricultural calendar that governed daily life was simultaneously a religious calendar that marked the movements of celestial deities through their annual journeys across the heavens, creating integrated frameworks for understanding time that unified practical necessity with spiritual meaning. The month of Nisanu, corresponding roughly to March-April in modern calendars, marked the beginning of the agricultural year and was sacred to Marduk, whose victory over the chaos goddess Tiamat was reenacted during the 11-day Akitu festival. The timing of this celebration coincided with the spring equinox, when day and night achieved perfect balance, symbolizing the cosmic harmony that Marduk maintained through his defeat of chaotic forces. The ritual activities during Nisanu involved the entire population of a major cities in ceremonial actions that renewed both cosmic order and social relationships. Debts were forgiven, prisoners were released, and social hierarchies were temporarily suspended as communities celebrated their collective participation in the cosmic renewal that made continued life possible. These temporary reversals of normal social arrangements served not to undermine authority, but to reinforce it by demonstrating that human social order participated in larger patterns of cosmic organization. The month of Tishri, corresponding to September-October, marked the autumn equinox and was dedicated to Nabu, god of writing and wisdom, whose festival celebrated the completion of the agricultural cycle and the preservation of knowledge through the transition into winter. During Tishri, scribal schools held graduation ceremonies, new tablets were inscribed with important documents, and libraries were reorganized to ensure the preservation of accumulated wisdom through the dormant season. The psychological insight embedded in these seasonal observances demonstrates the Mesopotamian understanding of human consciousness as part of larger natural rhythms that required acknowledgement and integration for psychological health and spiritual development. The festivals provided structured opportunities for communities to process the emotional and spiritual challenges associated with major life events transitions, creating collective frameworks for managing change that individual psychology alone could not adequately address. The daily observances that structured temple life throughout the year reveal the minute attention to detail that characterized Anunnaki worship and the sophisticated understanding of how routine practices could maintain spiritual awareness in the midst of ordinary activities. Each day began before dawn with ritual purification of temple spaces, lighting of sacred fires, and presentation of morning offerings that awakened the deities and prepared them to receive petitions and provide guidance for the day's activities. The morning offerings included bread, beer, oil, and incense presented according to carefully prescribed formulas that varied according to the calendar date, the specific deity being honoured and the particular needs of the community. These offerings were not simply ceremonial gestures but were understood as actual nourishment for divine beings whose continued presence and activity required regular sustenance from human worshippers. The midday observances typically involved more elaborate rituals that addressed specific concerns brought by individual petitioners seeking divine assistance with personal problems or community leaders requesting guidance for administrative decisions. These rituals could include divination procedures, healing ceremonies, or blessing rituals that addressed the practical needs of worshippers while maintaining the theological frameworks that gave meaning to daily experience. The evening observances concluded each day's religious activities with thanksgiving rituals that acknowledged divine protection and blessing, rituals of preparation that sought divine guidance for the next day's activities, and ceremonial closing of temple spaces that symbolically restored the cosmic order that human activity might have disturbed during the day. The mathematical precision that governed these daily rituals reflects the Mesopotamian understanding of religious practice as participation in cosmic order rather than arbitrary ceremonial activity. The timing of ritual actions, the quantities of offerings, the spatial arrangements of ceremonial objects, and the verbal formulas used in prayers all followed mathematical relationships that encoded theological concepts about the structure of divine reality. The base 60 number system that structured Mesopotamian mathematics emerged from these religious applications and reflected understanding of cosmic time based on the 360-day year, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, with additional days added as needed to maintain synchronization with astronomical cycles. This mathematical framework created unified systems for understanding temporal relationships that integrated daily experience with cosmic patterns spanning millennia. The weights and measures used in temple offerings followed similar mathematical principles that created standardized relationships between different commodities and their ritual significance. The shekel weight, the barley measure, and the oil allocation all maintained proportional relationships that encoded theological concepts about divine preferences and cosmic harmony, while providing practical frameworks for economic exchange. The architectural principles that governed temple construction demonstrate another application of sacred mathematics that integrated practical engineering requirements with theological symbolism. The proportions of ziggurat construction, the orientations of temple buildings, and the spatial relationships between different ceremonial areas all followed mathematical formulas that created sacred spaces capable of containing divine presence while accommodating human worship activities. The famous ziggurat at Babylon, known as a Temenanki, incorporated mathematical relationships based on the number 7, reflecting the 7 celestial spheres recognized by Mesopotamian astronomy and the 7-day week that structured temporal experience. Each of the 7 terraces maintained proportional relationships to the others based on mathematical formulas that created architectural harmony, while encoding theological concepts about the relationship between earthly and celestial realms. The engineering techniques required for constructing these massive structures pushed the boundaries of available technology and created innovations that influenced architectural development throughout the ancient world. The use of bitumen as waterproofing material, the development of fired brick technology, and the creation of sophisticated drainage systems all emerged from religious architectural projects and found applications throughout Mesopotamian civilization. The urban planning principles that governed Mesopotamian city development were deeply influenced by religious concepts about sacred space and cosmic order. Cities were understood as earthly reflections of divine order, with temple complexes serving as focal points around which residential, commercial, and administrative districts were organized according to theological principles about proper relationships between sacred and secular activities. The city of Babylon during the Neo-Babylonian period exemplifies this integration of religious symbolism with practical urban planning. The famous processional way that led from the Ishtar Gate to the central temple complex was designed not merely as a transportation route, but as a sacred pathway that guided worshippers through increasingly sacred spaces, while providing practical access for the thousands of people who participated in major festivals. The residential districts of Babylonian cities were organized according to occupational specializations that reflected divine patronage of different crafts and trades. Metalworkers lived in districts associated with the god Ninurta, textile workers in areas sacred to the goddess Ninlil, and merchants in areas sacred to the god Ninurta neighborhoods under the protection of the god Nabu. This arrangement created communities of shared professional interests while maintaining religious frameworks that gave meaning to economic activities. The sanitation systems developed for major Mesopotamian cities demonstrate the practical applications of religious concepts about purity and pollution that influenced urban planning throughout the ancient world. The drainage networks, waste disposal systems, and water supply infrastructure were designed according to religious principles that understood cleanliness as essential for maintaining divine favor and community health. The social stratification that characterized Mesopotamian civilization was legitimized through religious concepts about divine hierarchy that provided theological justification for political and economic inequality, while also creating moral obligations that limited the exploitation of subordinate classes. The understanding that all human beings were servants of the Anunnaki created shared identity that transcended social distinctions, while acknowledging different levels of responsibility and authority. The institution of slavery in Mesopotamian society was regulated by religious laws that provided protections for enslaved people and opportunities for manumission that reflected theological concepts about divine justice and human dignity. Slaves could own property, enter into contracts, and appeal to religious authorities for protection against abuse, creating legal frameworks that limited exploitation while maintaining social hierarchies. The position of women in Mesopotamian society was complex and varied significantly according to social class, historical period, and regional traditions, but was generally more favorable than in many later ancient civilizations due to religious concepts that recognized feminine divine authority and the importance of women's roles in maintaining cosmic order through their participation in fertility, wisdom, and justice. Women of the upper classes could serve as priestesses, administrators, and business owners who wielded considerable economic and political influence through their religious roles. The Naditu priestesses, for example, controlled substantial temple estates and engaged in commercial activities that made them among the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in their communities. The legal rights of women included the ability to own property, initiate divorce proceedings, and represent themselves in court cases, reflecting religious concepts about feminine wisdom and justice that provided theological support for women's legal autonomy. The goddess Ninhursag, who presided over legal disputes involving women, was understood as especially protective of women's rights and interests. The marriage customs that governed family formation were deeply embedded within religious frameworks that understood matrimony as participation in cosmic fertility that maintained the continuation of both human society and divine order. Wedding ceremonies involved elaborate rituals that invoked the blessing of multiple Anunnaki deities and created sacred bonds that extended beyond the immediate couple to encompass their families and communities. The inheritance laws that governed the transmission of property across generations were based on religious concepts about family continuity and divine blessing that provided theological justification for economic arrangements, while also creating obligations for mutual support that strengthened community solidarity. Children were understood as gifts from the gods who brought divine blessing to families, while also inheriting responsibilities for maintaining ancestral traditions. The educational opportunities available to children of different social classes were structured according to religious concepts about divine calling and social responsibility that provided pathways for social mobility while maintaining overall social stability. The scribal schools that served the temple complexes offered advanced education to talented students, regardless of family background, creating meritocratic elements within otherwise hierarchical social arrangements. The foreign relations that connected Mesopotamian city-states with neighbouring peoples were conducted according to diplomatic protocols that reflected religious concepts about divine authority and cosmic order. Treaties were understood as sacred oaths sworn before the Anunnaki deities, creating religious obligations that provided moral foundations for international cooperation, while also justifying military action against oathbreakers. The trade relationships that connected Mesopotamian cities with partners throughout the known world were regulated by commercial law that reflected religious concepts about divine justice and fair exchange. Merchant guilds operated under the patronage of specific deities who were understood as protectors of honest commerce and punishers of fraud and exploitation. The military institutions that defended Mesopotamian cities were organized according to religious concepts about divine protection and righteous warfare that provided moral frameworks for the use of force, while creating obligations for the protection of non-combatants and the humane treatment of prisoners. Armies were blessed by priests before major campaigns and carried divine standards that identified them as servants of particular Anunnaki deities. The judicial systems that maintained law and order within Mesopotamian communities operated according to religious concepts about divine justice that provided moral authority for legal decisions, while creating procedures for appeal and review that limited arbitrary exercise of power. Judges were understood as representatives of divine authority, who were obligated to follow divine law rather than personal preference or political pressure. The penal institutions that punished convicted criminals were designed according to religious concepts about divine retribution and human redemption that emphasized restoration over revenge while maintaining community safety and social order. Punishments were graduated according to the severity of crimes and the social status of victims and perpetrators, but included opportunities for rehabilitation and reintegration that reflected theological concepts about divine mercy and human possibility for moral improvement. The healthcare systems that served Mesopotamian communities integrated medical treatment with religious healing that addressed both physical symptoms and spiritual causes of illness. Hospitals associated with temple complexes provided care for the poor and indigent, while also serving as training centers for medical students and research institutions for the development of new treatments and pharmaceutical preparations. The astronomical observatories that supported Mesopotamian science and divination were technological marvels that created precise measurements of celestial phenomena, while providing religious frameworks for interpreting natural events as expressions of divine communication. The mathematical models developed in these observatories influenced scientific development throughout the ancient world, while serving religious purposes that gave meaning to intellectual investigation. The libraries that preserved Mesopotamian literature and learning were not merely repositories of written materials, but were active intellectual centers where scholars engaged in research, debate, and commentary that advanced human knowledge while serving religious purposes. The preservation and transmission of ancient wisdom was understood as sacred duty that participated in divine creativity and cosmic order. The workshops that produced the material culture of Mesopotamian civilization were organized according to religious concepts about divine craftsmanship and sacred creativity that elevated manual labor to spiritual practice, while maintaining technical standards that produced goods of exceptional quality and beauty. The guild systems that regulated craft production combined economic cooperation with religious devotion that created strong community bonds and high professional standards. The agricultural systems that supported Mesopotamian population growth were managed according to religious concepts about divine blessing and human stewardship that emphasized sustainable practices and community cooperation while maximizing productivity. The crop rotation systems, irrigation management, and seed selection techniques developed by Mesopotamian farmers influenced agricultural development throughout the ancient world, while serving religious purposes that connected daily work with cosmic order. The environmental challenges that eventually contributed to the decline of Mesopotamian civilization were recognized by contemporary observers who developed theological interpretations that understood ecological degradation as consequences of human failure to maintain proper relationships with divine authority. The prophetic literature that emerged from this period contains sophisticated environmental analysis that remains relevant for contemporary discussions about sustainability and ecological responsibility. The gradual transformation of Mesopotamian civilization under foreign rule was facilitated by the adaptability of Anunnaki religious traditions that could accommodate new political arrangements while maintaining cultural continuity. The Persian, Greek, and Roman administrators who governed Mesopotamian territories generally worked within existing religious frameworks rather than attempting to replace them entirely, creating synchristic arrangements that preserved traditional wisdom while adapting to changed circumstances. The survival of Mesopotamian cultural elements in later civilizations demonstrates the profound influence that 5 millennia of Anunnaki-centered development had on the fundamental structures of human society. The legal principles, educational methods, architectural techniques, and religious concepts that emerged from Mesopotamian civilization provided foundations for later cultural development throughout the Middle East, Mediterranean world, and beyond. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization through archaeological investigation has revealed the sophistication and relevance of ancient wisdom traditions that had been largely forgotten by the modern world. The decipherment of cuneiform script and the excavation of major archaeological sites have provided access to knowledge systems that offer valuable insights for contemporary challenges, while demonstrating the continuity of human experience across vast expanses of time. The scholarly analysis of Mesopotamian religious traditions has revealed theological sophistication that rivals the greatest achievements of later religious thought, while providing historical perspective on the development of concepts that continue to influence contemporary spiritual life. The integration of practical and spiritual concerns that characterized Anunnaki worship offers models for addressing the fragmentation that characterizes much contemporary religious experience. The institutional innovations that emerged from Mesopotamian religious life provided templates for organizing complex societies that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility while maintaining cultural continuity across generations of change. The temple complexes, scribal schools, legal systems, and administrative hierarchies developed in service of Anunnaki worship influenced institutional development throughout the ancient world and continue to shape contemporary organizational thinking. The technological achievements that emerged from religiously motivated investigation and innovation demonstrate the potential for spiritual devotion to drive practical problem-solving that serves human needs while expanding knowledge and capability. The mathematical, astronomical, medical, and engineering advances that emerged from Anunnaki worship provided foundations for later scientific development, while serving religious purposes that gave meaning to intellectual investigation. The artistic and literary achievements that expressed Mesopotamian religious understanding represent some of humanity's earliest systematic exploration of fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and human destiny through creative expression. The epic narratives, lyric poetry, visual arts, and musical compositions that emerged from Anunnaki worship influenced cultural development throughout the ancient world, while exploring themes that remain relevant for contemporary audiences. The psychological insights embedded in Mesopotamian religious traditions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human consciousness, social dynamics, and spiritual development that anticipated many discoveries of modern psychology while providing practical frameworks for individual growth and community healing. The therapeutic functions of religious ritual, the social psychology of festival celebration, and the developmental psychology of initiation practices all received sophisticated analysis in Anunnaki-related texts. As we drift deeper into the ancient rhythms of contemplation and rest, let the vast scope of this 5,000-year conversation about meaning, order, and transcendence provide context for our contemporary searching and questioning. The Mesopotamians who created and maintained these traditions faced challenges similar to our own: rapid technological change, environmental degradation, social inequality, cultural fragmentation, and the need to create institutions that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential wisdom. Their solutions were not perfect, and their civilization eventually succumbed to pressures that exceeded their adaptive capacity. But their achievement in creating religious and cultural institutions that maintained continuity and meaning across 50 centuries of change demonstrates the potential for human creativity and cooperation when directed toward constructive purposes that serve both individual and collective needs. The Anunnaki religious system they developed provided frameworks for understanding existence that integrated cosmic and personal scales, temporal and eternal perspectives, practical and spiritual concerns in ways that enabled them to create one of humanity's most successful and enduring civilizations. The theological sophistication, institutional innovation, and cultural achievements that emerge from their religious devotion continue to influence human societies in ways that are often invisible but nonetheless profound. In the approaching silence of sleep, these ancient currents of wisdom and devotion provide foundations deeper than individual consciousness, more reliable than personal memory, more enduring than any single lifetime. The conversations that began in reed huts beside ancient rivers continue in every human community that takes seriously the challenge of creating meaningful relationships with transcendent mystery. The Anunnaki become not historical artifacts, but living symbols of humanity's eternal dialogue with the sources of existence, creativity, and meaning that make conscious life possible. Their bureaucratic heaven reflects not supernatural reality, but human recognition that consciousness itself is a form of cosmic administration, organizing experience into patterns that create purpose from randomness and beauty from chaos. Let their patient exploration of divine order become your own gentle journey into the deeper mysteries that sleep makes accessible, where individual awareness merges with the universal processes of growth, change, and renewal that drive all evolution and development. In dreams, the boundaries between ancient and modern, individual and universal, human and divine, dissolve into the vast healing rhythms that govern all transformation and becoming. The clay tablets have crumbled, but the questions they preserved about how to live wisely, love deeply, work meaningfully, and face uncertainty with courage remain as urgent and as promising today as when they were first inscribed by hands that have long since returned to dust. The ziggurats have fallen, but the aspiration they embodied toward connection with transcendent reality continues to inspire every human heart that seeks to transform ordinary existence into something sacred, meaningful, and beautiful. In the gentle darkness of approaching sleep, consciousness gradually releases its grip on immediate concerns and joins the eternal human conversation about purpose, meaning, and the mysterious gift of being aware in a universe that seems designed to support the emergence of wonder, love, and understanding. The Anunnaki endure not as supernatural beings, but as enduring symbols of humanity's capacity to find sacred meaning in the midst of ordinary existence, to create beauty from practical necessity, to discover wisdom through patient attention to the patterns that connect all things in the magnificent ongoing mystery of conscious life in an endlessly fascinating and infinitely generous cosmos.